Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi has visited Oman. Not only does this trip build upon the brotherly ties that exist between the two countries, they discuss regional issues. Iran's president has said that regional countries should solve their problems and that foreign powers should not interfere and leave the region altogether. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at the relationship between these two countries and look at the role that Iran plays when it comes to other countries in the region, including problem areas like Palestine and the presence of foreign forces. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Expert in West Asian Affairs Kevin Barrett joins us from Madison. Also joining us is journalist and political analyst Syed Mohsin Abbas, who joins us from Islamabad. Welcome to you both. Let me first start with you, if I may, Kevin Barrett, and ask you about the visit by Iran's president to Oman. It was pretty wide in terms of the MOUs that were signed, 12 agreements, cooperation agreements from what we understand. So in terms of trade, it was obviously very fruitful. And prior to that, they revived a gas pipeline that was in the works for quite some time. How do you see this relationship in terms of its significance, especially for the region altogether?
Well, this is a very good move for Iran, Oman, and the whole region. The 12 cooperation agreements cover all kinds of ground. And as you suggested, one of the most important, probably the most important, is that gas pipeline issue. That's been in the works for well over a decade. And of course, the Western powers, well, that's a euphemism really for the United States, which is largely under Israeli control when it comes to U.S. Mideast policy, has been blocking it and trying to find ways to make sure it doesn't happen. And now it may be that the Americans are of two minds. On the one hand, of course, they're still brutally sanctioning Iran. They're being completely unreasonable in their JCPOA negotiations, and they're obviously still under the thumb of the Zionists. But on the other hand, they have a huge problem on their hands in Ukraine, where, contrary to what the Western media tells us, Russia is achieving its objectives in this special military operation. And at this point, with energy prices soaring and Europe trying to find a way to live without Russian gas and oil, but gas being the biggest problem, and the U.S. Desperately trying to make sure the Europeans stay on this course of boycotting Russia and substituting liquid gas, the propane variety, for the gas they've been importing from Russia through pipelines from Russia. There's a huge market right now for this liquid gas that can be shipped overseas. And apparently Oman wants to manufacture that. And Iran has one of the largest, possibly about the largest, or tied for number one in terms of all gas reserves. So it may be a propitious time for this. And it may be a time for Iran to break out of its isolation, or it's not really isolated, of course. Iran is trading with most of the world, including the biggest countries like China, as well as Russia and many others. But it's been hammered by the West and the United States at the direction of the Zionists. But this may be a time to change that. And by breaking out and becoming a savvy player in regional diplomacy, building on this relationship with Oman, we could see a sea change in the region as other regional powers understand that the future of the region is in independence and autonomy and freedom from Zionism and imperialism.
Well, let's take a look at some of the stances taken, and one of the most important ones that came out of this meeting, Syed Mohsin Abbas, is what Raisi noted about dialogue and cooperation, where he said the remarkable key point is that dialogue and cooperation among the regional countries creates security, would create security, but the presence of foreign forces would not, by any means, and could even threaten regional security. First of all, what do you think about that, and isn't that a direct reference to the U.S.?
It is absolutely a direct reference to the U.S. I think Iran has long held that the West Asia region, or the region surrounding Iran, must become much more autonomous, independent, and not reliant on the United States as the local policeman, which is exactly what the Arab world has largely facilitated. I mean, they've cooperated and collaborated in their own, if you like, their own subordination. And let's not forget that Donald Trump, for all his ills, he said it very, very plainly. He said, we're here to milk the cow. And he was referring to Saudi Arabia. But of course, that extends to Kuwait, extends to the United Arab Emirates, and all the Gulf region, really. And that's exactly what the Americans have been doing and continue to do. And of course, Israel gets its benefits from that. American boots on the ground will support you militarily and strategically. What Iran is saying is that, look, we're here to stay. America's going to eventually leave. They don't belong in this region. They belong in the Americas. But when the oil runs out, when your gas runs out, when they no longer want to milk you as cows, what are they going to do then? Who are you going to turn to? So the reality is that the Arab nations need to think very, very deeply about their longer-term interests. And I think Iran has continually offered them a very reasonable alternative, and that is, it was first of all, I think, in trying to, even in President Rouhani's era, where he launched the Hope Initiative in the 74th session in the UN General Assembly. That Hormuz peace endeavor floundered with a counter, if you like, measure by the Americans and the Israelis to open up relations with the UAE and to sort of open up more relations with Bahrain, et cetera, the Moroccans too. But of course, this visit of Amir Abdullahian to Oman and meeting Sultan Haytham bin Tariq is a positive indicator from the Iranian policy perspective, in the sense that upgrading those cultural and political reactions or those relations rather to higher levels of economic and business cooperation kind of set a pattern and a trend. And it's not an isolated trend, because Iran's Customs Administration spokesman Ruhollah Latifi said very recently that Iran's trade exchanges with its neighbors from March to December 2021 were valued at 92 million tons in volume and more than $46.2 billion in cash. And that constituted basically an increase of 13% in volume and 28% in monetary value from the year prior. Now, that also added to that is that Oman has had a 40% increase in its bilateral trade with Iran during the past year as well. So you can see that Iran is making inroads into creating not only that sense that there should be an independent West Asia which really relies on its own economic power for itself, rather than being milked like a cow, as it has been done for maybe 6 or 7 decades or more.
Sure. It's interesting, Kevin Barrett, our guest there, mentioned the Hope Initiative that was actually presented by the former Iranian President Rouhani at the UNGA. And just made me think about one of the failed initiatives that the U.S. At one point had proposed years ago, and that was what we call West Asia, this region, the West Asian Arab NATO. Remember that? How it flopped? It didn't even take off. However, this initiative that Syed Mohsin Abbas talks about is something that actually Oman has taken the lead now on that, insisting on continuing the cooperation with Iran to provide maritime security and to counter maritime terrorism in the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz. So in that light, Oman has taken the lead, and that is very significant, isn't it?
Indeed, yes. This kind of security cooperation with Iran will ultimately be in the interests of other countries in the region as well. These countries that currently are experiencing the difficulties of being essentially, if not exactly colonized, but certainly client states of a declining empire. And as the U.S. empire continues to decline, this whole notion of an Arab NATO and global NATO and so on will seem more and more absurd, because obviously what NATO really is it's a euphemism for the U.S. military occupation of Europe, which began after World War II and never ended. And the rest of the world doesn't particularly want to be occupied by a single unipolar hegemonic empire. There are better ways to ensure global and regional security that can also preserve the autonomy and independence and sovereignty of the nations involved. And of course, that is what Russia says it's ultimately fighting NATO about. And it's also what China, the rising #2 power, espouses. And given the economic changes in the world, as the West's share of global GDP declines precipitously, clearly the future is in these kind of independent regional security arrangements between sovereign nations in a multipolar world, rather than everybody signing up for some super NATO and being occupied by the US military in a unipolar world. That's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen.
Looking at the respective countries, which we will take a look at that, Syed Mohsin Abbas, one thing that just stands out, preventing security and stability to be established in the region, no matter practically wherever you look at, is Israel. Whether you look at Syria, whether you look at, for example, Iraq in terms of Erbil, and of course with the way that the occupation is being exercised, with the rights of Palestinians being violated on a daily basis. Putting that next to the normalization of some of these Arab countries, isn't that one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest, to make sure this region is free from outside interference? And of course, Israel is being steered by the US in some respects.
If Israel wasn't in West Asia, there would be peace throughout the region. I have absolutely no doubt about that. The fact that the Americans are there is primarily because they have this kind of bizarre commitment to an illegitimate state, which is essentially committed to expansionism through its Yin-on plan, through its peripheral, so-called expansion policy as well. These are all givens that the American Congress seems absolutely incapable and deterred in terms of trying to change policy-wise. The fact is that big Zionist capitalist corporate mafias control the bulk of American politics, and unfortunately, that is what dictates the situation in the Middle East as it is today. Now, Israel will not stop its expansionism. It's currently more paranoid than it's ever been before, predominantly because the Islamic Republic of Iran has stood tall and has managed to assemble a resistance axis which is saying no to the oppression of all the oppressed in that region, and particularly the Palestinians. So until Israel can, first of all, really negotiate its own self-annihilation, essentially, there will be no peace in that region, because what they're doing is buying up these other proxy states like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and then they are pushing forward illogical, irrational foreign policies, largely which are aimed at securing the interests of Israel, not the interests of Saudi Arabia or the interests of the Bahrainis, etc. So, for instance, the war of the Saudis in Yemen does no justice to them. There's no need for them to have that war. They're so wealthy, they hardly need Yemen to become any wealthier. The war, for instance, in Syria, which the Saudis and the Gulf nations engaged in, was another war that they financed on the say-so of CENTCOM and the Israeli sort of military establishment and the big boys who want to dictate the affairs in the region. So everything is wrong about Israel being in the Middle East, just simply from the point of view of peace, prosperity, and, if you like, stability. The Islamic Republic of Iran, by contrast, has not invaded any of these countries,
right.
Not for 200 years have the Iranians stepped outside of their own territories. They've been largely rather invaded. So the same Israeli and American forces imposed an 8-year war on Iran, killed over 1 million, if you like, soldiers or citizens, one way or another, of that region. Since then, they haven't stopped. Iraq, Syria, up even as far as Libya, if you want to count Afghanistan. These are all bordering, mainly
Sure.
They are bordering countries to Iran. And so, of course, that mass chaos and that warfare is what Iran is trying to avert for the future with its policies in the region now.
So, but you have to put this into context for us in terms of how this works out when you have, for example, the UAE, Kevin Barrett, courting Syria, just one of the countries, which indicates obviously there's a shift underway when it comes to Syria, along with Jordan, who has done the same, and Bahrain. In the meantime, these are countries that have a relationship or have formalized the relationship, which, by the way, did exist before, but they just came out and formalized it to the world with Israel. So how does that work out? I mean, when you have them reinstating Syria into the fold, so to speak, but yet at the same time have this relationship with Israel?
Well, they're trying to play both sides, and that's understandable because we're in a period of shift. The geopolitics of the region and of the world is moving fairly rapidly, perhaps increasingly so, towards this end of the unipolar American imperial era. And in the West Asian region, I agree completely with the other guests that there would be peace and prosperity absent this illegitimate Zionist entity, which is the root cause of the worst conflicts. And we see how its lawlessness with the assassination of Colonel Hassan Syed Hodei the other day on Sunday, and then a couple of weeks ago, the murder of the American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh these are just two recent examples of this kind of ridiculously lawless psychopathic behavior from the Zionist entity. So why would these countries like the Emirates and some others that are moving towards a more rational and balanced regional policy and openly recognizing Syria, perhaps against the orders of their usual masters in Washington, why would they be moving towards friendship with the Zionist entity? Again, I think that they are kind of trying to bet on both sides or situate themselves in such a way that they can draw some sort of profit to themselves and political advantages from their seemingly friendly relations with the Zionists. But we have to remember that the change in the region is towards more independence from the imperial powers and the Zionists who run and own them. And so I think that these people who are betting on profiting from a short period of friendship with the Zionists are also seeing that in the long term, the Zionist entity is likely to go the way of the dinosaurs, and that's why they are simultaneously open to these kinds of regional peace initiatives like we're seeing with Iran and Oman.
And it's very interesting in terms of Syria. We have some more hotspots that we need to talk about, but can't leave this one alone yet, Syed Mohsin Abbas. And that is the fact that you have what happened days ago for the first time, where the Russian S-300 missile defense system actually fired shots for the first time, enacted by Russia, towards those fighter jets that had bombed Syria. And there were speculations at this point that that is because of the fact that Israel has supported Ukraine in the special military operation that Russia has done. Can you explain to us how Russia fits now into the picture when it comes to Israel? Because Syria remains a country that Israel just continues to bomb, which it did again just a couple of days ago.
Well, this has been a bit of a thorny issue. The Russians, quite clearly, whilst they came to Syria and supported the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hezbollah, and the Syrian government in, if you like, averting the collapse of Syria, essentially, and the occupation of Syria by Zio-American forces, they at the same time have been playing a balancing game. They have had amicable relations with Israel. The Russians have many citizens that actually go and live in Israel itself. There are clear indications that the Israeli establishment goes to and fro and has largely garnered the neutrality, at least, of Russia in affairs. And in fact, there was also talk of Russia agreeing that they wouldn't use these S-300s. In fact, they wouldn't do anything to prevent Israeli warplanes dominating Syrian airspace. There seemed to be an informal agreement between all the powers as to who dominated which part of the aerial sectors. Now, one Russian plane was actually shot down accidentally, it seems, or the Israelis played a certain game in which they shadowed in such a way that the Russians weren't able to save one of their aircraft, and actually several Russians died. That didn't trigger any kind of major response from the Russians. They certainly obviously raised concerns. But what's happening now in Ukraine, it seems as though, again, where Ukraine has a large support from Israel, it also has a lot of Ukrainians who are in Israel as well. It seems as though Israel has been torn between keeping that neutrality with Russia and going in and supporting the American and NATO aggressions, essentially, in Ukraine. That's been a choice that it hasn't been able to avoid. And it seems as though some of the exchanges between Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Israelis have got very, very deep. And perhaps this could see the signal, well, it could signal the Russians taking a more hard line on Israel in West Asia as well, and particularly in Syria. That remains to be seen.
Sure. And what remains to be seen, but it seems to be on a positive track, and this could change not only the equation on the ground, but also it's almost like a tectonic shift that's going to happen. And that is the way that Iran and Saudi Arabia have had some degree of rapprochement with each other. They are talking to each other. There has been some progress, but it's not there yet. At the same time, Saudi Arabia not only it doesn't even have a channel of communication open with the U.S. President Joe Biden. It doesn't even talk to Joe Biden, the Saudi Crown Prince, including the UAE. So if that remains that way, and Iran and Saudi Arabia continue and open up embassies, for example, does that mean then that could be the final straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the U.S. not having really the solid footing in the region any longer?
Yes, I think it would be. I think that the Saudis have played the key role in maintaining U.S. dominance of the region, and they are the swing oil producer globally. And so their importance, despite the fact that their rulers have not always been particularly competent or exemplary, they have played an outsized role in the world. And now that suddenly we see them moving out of the American orbit, as indeed the Saudi king had threatened to do in the summer of 2001, just a month before 9/11, he said that the writing is on the wall. He said it's time for, quote, the parting of the ways. And in fact, it was only the false flag operation of 9/11 that allowed the Americans and their Zionist masters to reel Saudi Arabia back into the American orbit. We could see something like that again. And if so, it will be good for the region and for the world.
I'm sorry to jump in. We're just fresh out of time. Thank you for that, Kevin Barrett, expert in West Asian affairs from Madison. Syed Mohsin Abbas, a pleasure, from Islamabad, journalist and political analyst. Thank you. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mikhail Vitapway and the team. It's goodbye until next time.